welcome a wonderful guest. We are so excited to get some time with lawyer, producer, writer. I don't even know what other.
You're not even talking about me this time.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not. Jeff loves when I do the lawyer thing because he does that in his day job. Kelsey Trainor, these are exciting times for women in sports. Thanks for giving us a few minutes to talk about it all.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
This is exciting. We've been watching some of what you've been saying as this process goes forward. And I wanted to start with a tweet that you have pinned from 2019 on your Twitter account. Regarding a 400-meter race that illustrates why women need more sports coverage from the media. Can you talk about that for our audience, about what the difference is and what that illustrates?
Yeah, it's really to illustrate the kind of head start that men's sports has had in terms of investment and coverage. And people don't really talk about that enough when they start comparing men's sports and women's sports to either revenue or viewership. They really try to do apples to apples, but you can't, right? Like when you look back at, soccer in Europe, women's soccer was banned. Before that, they were selling out stadiums, 50,000 people, in the early 1900s were there. The NBA for the first, 20, 25 years wasn't profitable at all. And so it's really just kind of giving that visual explanation of like, if you're going to start a 400-meter race and everybody's going to start from the exact same point, right, then it's not a fair race. So women's sports is in that outside lane. And if they're starting from there and they're not kind of staggered upwards like you would in a 400-meter race, then it's going to keep remaining that way. So it's just a visual to illustrate the equality versus equity, right? Things that can be done to really help women's sports, to get you to be able to compare men's and women's sports as apples to apples. And then, if the viewership and the revenue isn't there, right, then it's a valid argument. But it's a really hard thing to do right now when men's sports have had, such an advanced start.
One of the reasons we wanted to have you on is even to me more frustrating than that. With women's soccer, they're not starting at the same place. Women's soccer is light years ahead of men's soccer in the success that they've had during most of our lifetimes. And yet they have had to fight tooth and nail to get equal pay, despite the fact that they are the team that most of this country gets to see in a World Cup. And they are the team that is successful in the World Cup. And they are the ones whose names you know and jerseys that you wear. And you've been involved in that process. What has it been like for you to now see that there is equal pay amongst the teams?
Honestly, I didn't know that it would happen. There's a lot that went into it. And you had, back in May 2020, the judge in the case actually dismissed the equal pay portion. So it was on appeal. And part of, the memo in dismissing the case was comparing the men's and the women's collective bargaining agreements. Again, we're talking about comparing apples to oranges, right? You couldn't. The women had guaranteed salaries, the men didn't, right? But that's also because soccer worldwide, on the men's side, there's so much more money in it, right? For a number of the reasons that I've just stated before, right? The investment, the coverage that's always existed there. And so, a lot of some of the language that came out in the judge's opinion was saying, well, and actually, if you actually go back and look and compare the amount of money within the time frame of the lawsuit, the women's team actually made more. The reason that they made more was because they won. If they had not won, they would not have made more, right? Because the men's contract was really built on bonuses. And obviously the FIFA money, which has always been an issue. So I didn't think it would get done. I had always hoped. And so there's been a lot that's transpired. There's a lot of kind of higher ups at US Soccer that are no longer in charge. And Cindy Parlow-Cohn, who is the current president of US Soccer, she was a former player herself. She's been in this fight for equal pay as a player. So she kind of brought that perspective and trust back into the situation. And then, I have to give credit to the U.S. men's national team, right? They essentially they basically kind of gave up their upside, right? If they don't do well, then if they don't do well, then they're going to be fine. If they start winning, which they haven't, then they are going to be giving up money with the FIFA prize money now being pooled together and then split equally.
In terms of the long-term prospects of women sports and business, I've seen you say that it's bad business to not invest in women and be in the women's sports business. Explain to our listeners why. I agree with you, but for people who don't know, why?
Yeah, so often, obviously, women's sports has owners, maybe even players, people have considered it a charity, right? Like that's always been the mentality. You have the kind of the girl dad thing, right? Of like, I want to take my daughter to this and have her see this. Go back to like, young boys and girls should be seeing this. And when you talk about the investment side of things, men's sports have been invested in for so long. And they're going to continue to be invested in, and that's good. That's a good thing. But if you think about it in terms of upward growth, right, men's sports is going to kind of gradually keep ebbing and flowing upwards. Women's sports is down here, right? It's on a steady growth path, but the growth and the potential is so much higher. It has not even reached any of its potential. And so that's what we say, like, you need to get in now, right? You're already past kind of that like pre-seed, like if you think about it like a VC startup world, you're already kind of past that like pre-seed seed stage. You're maybe getting into more towards like a Series A. But you should get in now because the ROI is going to be there and you're already starting to see it. Rewind that a little bit back even further. Most men's sports are not profitable, right? But that doesn't stop people from investing in it, right? Because there are a bunch of business benefits from it, right? Whether that's tax purposes, et cetera, et cetera. And so I always say, invest in women, and that's really applied to the women's sports space because, it's not a charity thing, right? Like there is so much growth potential there, and you're starting to really see it.
Well, and we talked to somebody who Susie Petroselli last week, and we're talking about investments. There's now this opportunity. There was this interesting idea out in Minnesota of having basically kind of crowdfunding opportunities to kind of invest. Jason and I actually tried to invest and it was closed. We couldn't do it.
We need you to hook us up. We hear your
I got you. I'm an investor. I'm a quote unquote community owner in that. And I actually just was on a panel yesterday and it was talking about the expansion of the WNBA. An article just came out and they're going to be 1 or 2 new teams announced, 2 new markets announced by the end of the year. Philly is actually on that short list. Wanda Sykes, Dawn Staley have been kind of mentioned in that potential investment group. And it's exciting. The WNBA just raised $75 million in terms of like marketing and what they're doing. But I asked that question. I was like, can we kind of get a more community owned thing in the WNBA or the NWSL? And the answer is probably not, because the price is going up. The price is going way, way up, as it should be. And there's almost like a FOMO, like a fear of missing out about being in the women's sports space. There's only so many teams you can buy. You see the massive sale of Chelsea that just happened. These sports teams are selling for billions and billions of dollars.
Jason and I tried to buy Chelsea too. We couldn't.
They didn't let you in. Yeah,
no.
They didn't quite qualify for that.
And the Todd Bowley, his group actually tried to buy a women's sports team last year, a women's soccer team in the States. And so there's so much opportunity to get in, but it's good and bad that it's starting to go towards the billionaires instead of us, regular common folk.
Yeah, but how important when you talk about, you just mentioned Wanda Sykes and Dawn Staley, how important is it not just to have an increase in ownership interest, but have women as the people that are leading the organizations?
I think it's important, right? I'm not going to sit here and say that women don't have faults, right? Or can't be bad leaders or bad people. I'm not going to do that. But in terms of having the same opportunities to succeed, I think it's very important. And I've always said that I think more women with capital, more women with money to be able to invest in these things is the game changer. It's the best thing because there is some shared sense of your work experience, right? Or have you been part of the old boys club, right? Where you just don't feel like your voice is heard. So I don't think it's the only way, but I do think it's important, and I like to see it. And I think it's a little bit of a game changer in terms of potentially the culture of the organization. right? We haven't seen it. You really don't see it, right? So how are you going to know what it's going to look like? I obviously think it's about time we start seeing it and seeing what it looks like.
You talk about potential game changers. How do you think NIL money will impact women's athletics in terms of getting more money in the hands of female athletes who some of them have higher profiles than their male counterparts?
Yeah, if you look at all of the data that has come out since NIL has essentially been a free-for-all, I think the top, 3 of the top 5 sports and earners are women's sports, right? Women's basketball, softball, volleyball. There's always been a massive audience for it, right? I think it's on currently right now, the Women's College, the Softball World Series. That always draws huge numbers. And if you look at the social media statistics, which is a huge part of NIL, right? That's a huge place where these young athletes are getting these brands and the money, the brands out there. The women athletes have larger followings. And so I always thought it was a red herring argument in terms of how NIL would impact women's sports. A lot of people said, it would be a Title IX issue and all of these non-revenue sports would suffer, but the women athletes are doing really, really well. Gatorade, and I think it just came out too, Gatorade has started investing more money in women athletes than men athletes, or women's sports than men's sports. So I think it's happening, and it's great for women's sports. And kind of off of that, women's sports, there's so much less opportunity to play professionally in the women's sports space. There just is. There's less leagues, there's less roster sizes. And so when NIL obviously was not allowed, you're taking away probably one of the only opportunities these women athletes have to make money off of their sport. And so I think it's a huge advancement for these young women athletes. It's going to change the game for sure. I know it's an interesting tool and a conversation around recruiting. And but I personally, I like it, and I think it's gonna lead to some really, really cool advancements in this space.
You've talked about the struggle with regard to the number of opportunities there are for women in sports. You're on the board of the Sports Bra Project. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Sarah Dwyer, she's actually, I met her through the women's sports space, and she was on a trip, I believe, and I forget where she was, but she said it never occurred to her that the lack of a sports bra in some underdeveloped countries was a barrier to sport. She just never thought about it. And so when there's already so many barriers, you don't think about that little thing, right? That could really make such a massive impact on young women. And so we go around and we collect, get donations of sports bras and deliver them, not everywhere across the world. We have a relationship with Australia, and they're doing a lot there ahead of the World Cup that's going to be in Australia and New Zealand. And then just neighborhoods, communities all across the United States and across the world, and just doing this one little thing that helps keep women and young girls in sports longer, because there's a huge dropout rate compared to young boys.
We talk about people who are impacted with it being Pride Month. You have an Invest, Pay, Hire merchandise that proceeds go and benefit Athlete Alley to combat anti-trans and other anti-LGBTQ legislation. Can you talk to us about the effort, the shirt, and some of the homophobia and transphobia faced in sport and athletic communities? Yeah,
I mean, there's so many people fighting against trans athletes' participation in sports. And, you have the swimmer Leah Thomas at Penn, who, people were up in arms about. And I'm of the opinion, right, that there's so many people who are fighting against trans athlete participation, whether it's trans man or trans women in sport, in the name of quote unquote fairness, and really just not understanding what sport is, the vehicle it is, right? And that people who are, transitioning or going through that process, they're not doing it for fun, right? This is a true identity, their true identity, and they face so much more abuse than if they didn't do it, right? So it's not something people just start doing as a good time. And the narratives around cheating and unfairness, there's so much time spent around that, that it's really not an argument that I entertain, because it just doesn't really happen. And then the Invest and Pay Hire merch line really stemmed from this idea of like, what are actionable things we can do to advance women in sports and in the workplace? Sports are a microcosm of society. So if women are underpaid in sports, they're underpaid in society, et cetera, et cetera. And like, what can you do to help advance that? You can invest, right, with your time, your money. You can hire women, right? That's so simple. And then, especially in the sports space, there's a lot of like freelance and, do me this favor, I need this done, right? It's like, no, pay people their value for their work. And so that kind of where Pay Women came in. And it resonates with some people. Other people hate it. That's fine too. But it's been a fun thing to have. And, we've had like zero paid advertising around it, and it's already grossed like over $100,000. And the proceeds have gone to Athlete Ally, Black Girl Hockey Club, to get young Black girls and women involved in hockey, which is like not typically an inclusive space. And so it's been really cool. I love seeing it. I know Grant Williams, who's playing for the Celtics, I'm hoping they win because he's worn the shirt into a bunch of games. CJ McCollum, a bunch of NBA, NFL players have worn it. So it's been really cool to see the support in the male sports space.
It's cool what you're doing in terms of raising awareness and getting creative in terms of giving people the opportunity to show their own support too. Before we let you go, Jeff knows I'm fascinated by the lines and integration of gaming into sports now. You, in addition to all your advocacy, are now the VP of Business Affairs for the Gaming Society. Tell us about this next step. And one of the things I saw in there is Bet on Women. Talk us about the opportunities for gaming and women athletes.
Yeah. So, obviously sports betting has always been a taboo topic. And with the Supreme Court giving the go ahead for it to happen, you see so much money that these sports books are investing and that they're making off of the back of the athletes. And so we're really about getting some of that money into the hands of the athletes, obviously not in an irresponsible way or in a way that encourages it, but right. Like just understanding that, gamification is a way of community, right? Like I never watched any other football game besides an Eagles game until I started playing fantasy football. Then I was watching every game. I'm like, when Alshon Jeffrey was on the Chicago Bears, I was like, I need him to get 2 touchdowns today. Like I started watching those games. And so it's just translating that into the women's sports side of things, right? It's not always betting, but fantasy sports and free to play games, things that really build that conversation in that community, because the studies show that a lot of betting really does have to do with like that community. You're on the golf course, you're with your buddies. You're betting on every shot, right? And that's really, it's less about the money and it's more about the community aspect of it.
You haven't seen me play. I'm not betting on my shot.
and Jeff just often complains about his fantasy team. But, what we saw this week, be careful between Tommy Pham and Jock Peterson and Mike Trout. Fantasy sports could go a little bit overboard. We've seen now. So.
I love that. I love that, right? All press is good press, right? That really creates a conversation. And I'm also a firm believer of like women's sports, the coverage, it shouldn't always be sunshine and roses, right? Because that's not, and it's also not what makes the athlete or the sport interesting. The drama, the intrigue, all of that stuff should be covered in the same way that it is covered in men's sports. Kevin Durant is getting all of this coverage right now on things that he's talking about on social media and going back and forth with Stephen A. Smith. He's not even playing, right? But he's getting all of this coverage because of that. And I love it. I love it all. I love the good, the bad, the drama, and just leveraging that on the women's sports side to really, really focus on how we can improve some of that equity to really even it out into equality.
Well, he's doing a good job building his brand, and we hope you'll keep coming back as women get to build their brand. We really appreciate the time and having the conversation with us. You have a great day.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.